Earlier this year, I had the amazing opportunity of mentoring a North Korean refugee through Freedom Speakers International. Because I lived in the States and she lived in Korea, we were able to communicate through Zoom to combat the difference in time zones. Before meeting the woman I was matched with, I spoke to my mom about how nervous I was to meet her. I knew it would be a culturally fascinating experience for me, a Korean born and raised in the United States, to meet someone from a country I had heard so many negative things about. I had watched Korean movies such as 태극기를 휘날리며 and Welcome to Dongbakgol, where North Koreans were often called 빨갱이 or commies by inhabitants of other countries. I naturally assumed that all North Koreans worshipped their dictator, and I looked down at them for their mob mentality. When I was younger, I had met a few people from North Korea through my church, and I had even spent Christmas with one of them. My experience with North Korean refugees had quickly changed my perception of these people, and I scolded myself for being so caught up in what I had seen from movies. The day before I met the North Korean woman, I sat at my desk thinking about how to greet her. I knew I would greet her like I would greet any other adult, but I genuinely had no idea what to expect. Is she nice? Is she mean? Is she judgmental? What if we can't communicate? Because I was so nervous, I had a separate tab on my computer that was filled with responses to any questions she might have. It ranged from simple questions such as, "Where are you from?" to questions like, "What's your favorite ice cream flavor?" The next day, at 12 a.m. Mountain Time, I sat at my desk to meet her. She was one of the brightest people I had ever seen. She asked me lots of questions about myself, and I asked her lots as well. I was nervous because I didn't want to ask her anything she may have been sensitive about. Once we started the first lesson, we came up with a plan. For each lesson, we tackled a new part of her speech. We had sectioned off the speech into about 10 parts, and we focused on each part per section. She would read the section first as I listened for any areas that sounded awkward in pronunciation, then we would go back to review those parts. We frequently revisited specific words such as childhood, carrying, and unconsciousness. As the lessons went on, she skated through words she had struggled with in previous lessons. When I first met her, a small part of me still kept the stigma that she worshipped the North Korean dictator. However, as I said before, she was very bright and cheery. She was very open about her experience as a North Korean living in South Korea, as she actively wanted me to ask her any questions I had had about people like her. As I helped her through her speech, I had occasionally teared up when she would mention the horrible conditions of her childhood and how her whole world has changed from escaping. I had realized I had more stigmas about North Koreans as I heard her story again and again during each lesson. Though I cannot share the specific details of what she said in her speech and that she had told me personally, I had no idea that there were people who were still living in such unimaginable conditions. As I listened to her story, I found myself trying to guess what the next part of her story would be, because I thought I knew the lives of all North Koreans. I never interfered with her speech, and I engaged in conversations, but I realized I still held a stereotype of North Koreans. As soon as I detected it, I stopped myself. Any prejudice that I catch should end with me. I realized that stereotyping her or any North Koreans in general was stripping them of their individual identities and putting them under one label. I thought to myself, how could I possibly have done this again? I had made a promise and I broke it. I said that I hated all stereotypes, yet I sat there in front of my computer doing just that. I had told my friends that I was mentoring a North Korean refugee later on. I did not tell them any details of the woman I mentored, but I wondered what they had thought of North Koreans from a purely American perspective. Thankfully, my political science class began talking about dictatorships, and North Korea naturally came into discussion. Being the only Korean in the classroom, I had raised my hand to briefly tell the story of how my grandpa escaped North Korea. I told my class how he and his 6 siblings crossed the river and how he was self-conscious of his North Korean accent when he finally reached the South. I spoke of the death penalty and the camps in the country that my grandpa so feared. After class, my friends commented on how they thought North Korea was only filled with communists who worshipped their dictator. They had the same stigma as I did, and I quickly explained to them the reality of the country. As I said before, prejudice should stop with me if I am faced with it. If it was not for the opportunity of meeting a North Korean refugee who was living a stable life in South Korea, I would have lived the rest of my life believing that I was the only victim of stereotypes. I would have continued to feel sorry for myself and downplay the same stigmas that others were facing. I am thankful that I was able to catch myself sooner or later, but these stigmas will not end just because I stop myself. Our world is undoubtedly filled with discrimination and stereotypes. Though the efforts of individuals will make a difference, these issues will not end in itself. In order to create a world of acceptance, we must first learn to not judge others based on our limited experiences with them. To make a better world, it must start with us. I encourage you all to discard any minor or major stereotypes you believe in, and to start our process of changing the world. Thank you for listening.